So recently, multilingual disciplinary literacies have been studied a lot, and it has two elements, no? The multilingual element and the disciplinary literacy element. So I think that all of us more or less understand what multilingual is. So it is understanding and using more than one language. And nowadays we live in a really multilingual and multicultural world, and our classrooms are very multilingual and very multicultural. So we need to foster all of the languages at school, because it's not more about English or about Basque or about Spanish, but we need to use all of the languages for schooling. And on the other hand, we have the disciplinary literacy part. Literacy until now has been understood as learning to read, to write, but it is more about that. It is about the language that students use when they are talking about disciplines or when they are talking about school content. When they're talking about history, about science, about maths, they need to use some kind of language. So multilingual disciplinary literacies brings that together. The academic language that we need to use in disciplines, and also the multiple languages that students need to foster. So often when we think about multilingual societies, we think in societies in which, for example, English is predominant because it is now a lingua franca that is used almost everywhere. But some of the societies are also multilingual per se. And I believe, and we believe, that the Basque Country is one of those societies in which we have a minoritized language that is not the first language of most of the students. So this creates a challenge because most students study through a second language, which is also at the same time a minoritized language. So it is something that is very complex and very difficult, but we believe this creates a very interesting opportunity to understand how learners in a second language in immersion contexts acquire Basque, Spanish, English, and disciplinary literacies. Because, for example, in the Basque Country, 75% of students study through a D-model immersion model in which everything is taught to the meaning of Basque, and only 25% of the students has Basque as the first language. So this challenging but also interesting context is something that we believe can say a lot to the international audience. So in the field of disciplinary literacies, recently, many different models and many different constructs have been proposed. And we have selected cognitive discourse functions, or CDFs, as the acronym says, because they are somewhere in the middle between texts and between the lexicon. Because we understand, for example, that texts are very long in general. So we have a lab report, we have a philosophical dissertation, or we have these big texts that students need to use. And also at very small level, we have the vocabulary. So we have words like function, system, ecosystem, and all of these words that are very, very from the school and not from the general language. But we need something in the middle, because text or vocabulary may be too big or too small. So cognitive discourse functions, or CDFs, are that middle point. They reflect what students need to do with that they know. No, it's not just about learning about renewable energies or learning about Second World War. They need to do something with that information which needs language. So CDFs bring together that. It is about arguing, comparing, defining all these kinds of words that appear in the curriculum, they appear in textbooks, they appear in classroom interaction, but students need to do something with language when talking about content. And they have two important brackets, or two important branches. So we will have the discourse level. So for example, for arguing, you need to use your opinion, to reason, to give counter-arguments, but you also need specific linguistic resources. So saying in my opinion, for example, or saying because of that. So we believe that CDFs bring together these two, and this is something that needs to be addressed in multilingual context. So in our study, we studied how students from year 7 to year 10, which is between 12 and 16 years old, used CDFs in writing when talking about science, in this case, the topic of nutrition. So one of the main areas that we wanted to focus on was if they did similarly in Basque, Spanish, and English, if this differed according to their age, and if this differed according to the first language. I believe that one of the strongest and most important findings from my study was that age was the strongest predictor. No? So as students got older, they did better, which is something that may seem logical, but until now not many studies have focused on the role of age in writing development in the case of CDFs. And related to that, I believe that something that was really important to say is that this development is non-linear and it's not something that happens every 2 weeks. No? So we as teachers, as teacher educators, we need to understand that change takes some time. So in many cases, the changes were provident when looking at year 1 to year 3 or year 2 to year 4, or when looking at the whole secondary education, but not when comparing contiguous years, which I think this is something that mainly teaches to be more patient when waiting for changes to happen. Also, a second important finding for me was that when students improved in one language, they also did in the others. So improvement in Basque or development in Basque also led students to develop in Spanish or develop in English, which shows the multilingual nature of disciplinary literacy and academic language. And this is something important, particularly in a context in which Basque, for example, doesn't have that much exposure outside of the school. So we understand that there are connections between students' languages, and we should use those connections to foster that. And finally, another important aspect was that students' first language or the language that they use at home played a role. So, for example, students having Spanish did not improve after year 9, but they had a huge improvement from year 7 to year 9. And students having Basque, for example, improved all of the years, but very, very little. So they improved a bit from year 7 to year 8, a bit from year 8 to year 10. But these changes were very different depending on the first languages. So we believe that controlling or understanding students' needs related to their first languages is something important that we sometimes overlook in education. So we believe that 3 main important aspects should be taken into account for pedagogical implications. The first, and in my opinion the most important one, is awareness. So teachers really need to be aware about the language that they need to use in their subjects. So we need to include different ways in which the past, for example, is worked on in the history, or when students are making connections between 2 different elements in philosophy, we need to talk about how to make that connection. So we believe that the first step will be for teachers to be aware of the role of language in all of the subjects. The second one will be to design interventions, to design materials that take into account these roles of languages. For example, in collaborative research that we did with 4 science teachers, we found that if we included explicit teaching about argumentation in science, so if we taught students, okay, this is a good argument, this is not a good argument, this is how you should structure, they improved a lot, and they improved in all of the languages. So we believe that having an explicit way of tackling this is something that will help students. And the final one is making students aware of the role of different languages and the connections between languages. Because I believe that often we as teachers, okay, we are in an English subject, so we will be just talking in English. In the Spanish subject, we will be just talking in Spanish. But we need to make these connections. If we say students, okay, you know how to structure a text in Spanish, or you know how to write a letter in Basque. So the structure of the letter is very similar in Basque and Spanish and English. But students sometimes do not see it. We need to make them aware of, maybe you don't know these specific words in English, but you know what to say and you can find other ways. So I believe those 3 aspects are important. Teacher awareness, student awareness, and then designing with the role of language in mind.